weapons still doesn't negate for the fact that you got thousands of individuals that are already dead. And that's what the president said he was going to do something about.
Okay, caller, you laid out your points. We'll let our guests respond.
We will leave the last few minutes of this conversation to go live to the U.S. House of Representatives today. Members will take up a number of suspension bills. No legislative action on Syria today, though. That could happen later this week. And now live to the floor of the U.S. House here on C-SPAN.
The House will be in order. Prayer will be offered today by our guest chaplain, Reverend Dr. Herman Stockdale, Mount Vernon Missionary Baptist Church, Rochester, New York.
Heavenly Father, we acknowledge you with adoration and humble gratitude. We pray for your presence and guidance over this distinguished body before whom we stand. We thank you for this great land in which we live, the United States of America. And we thank you for all who share in making the policies, laws, and decisions which guide and govern our nation. We ask your blessings upon all of our elected and appointed leaders as they lead us to face the challenges of our day. Grant that we as a nation may be mindful of your providence and your grace as we give moral and ethical leadership to the people of our world. May justice, equality, and compassion always be the guiding principles for our way of life. And may we never forget that to whom much is given, much is required. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.
The chair has examined the journal of the last day's proceedings and announces to the House his approval thereof. Pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 1, the journal stands approved. Pledge of Allegiance today will be led by the gentleman from New York, Mr. Higgins. I pledge allegiance to the flag and to the republic which stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The chair will entertain up to 15 requests for 1-minute speeches on each side of the aisle. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona rise? For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona rise? Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week all eyes will be upon us as we debate the use of force in Syria. This decision is not one that should be made lightly, as ultimately there are many factors to be weighed. Make no mistake that what's happening in Syria is truly a human tragedy. That nation has been torn apart by civil war. And it is without a doubt that Assad is not a friend or an ally of ours. But things are very complicated. A large number of those who oppose the Assad regime are affiliated with al-Qaeda. In the case of Syria, Assad and the rebels, it cannot be said that the enemy of my enemy is not my friend. In this dangerous civil war, the enemy of our enemy is still and will always be our enemy. It is this dynamic which has led us to the overwhelming response of people throughout my district and our nation to say without imminent threat to national security, without a plan, without a goal, without unified international support from our allies, we must stay out of Syria. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York rise? Without objection, the gentleman from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, the situation in Syria is that of a national civil war. It's a sectarian and ethnic conflict between two warring factions, and this is not about democracy and freedom. There's no social contract, there's no constitution, there's no preamble, there's no unifying vision as to what Syria wants to become. This is a brutal battle between two bad sides for control. Assad is a brutal dictator for certain, but the opposition's best fighters are al-Qaeda and Islamic extremists bent on creating an Islamic State in Syria. The international community, 194 countries, has said, but for Turkey and France, that yes, United States, go get them, just don't ask us to participate. So the American people will find themselves once again, for the third time in a decade, in a region of the Middle East and South Asia, another civil war, essentially alone again. The American people want nation building, but right here at home in America. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina rise?
To address the House for 1 minute, revise the my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to oppose the President's action in Syria. I just returned from the Middle East, meeting with heads of state in Qatar, Egypt, United Arab Emirates, and our ambassador in NATO. I'm firmly convinced that any action on our part will further destabilize Syria and cause a collapse of that government. What will happen then? What will happen is that country will then fall in the hands of Hezbollah, Hamas, Al-Qaeda, Muslim Brotherhood. At the end of the day, what's important, Mr. Speaker, is who has control of those weapons of mass destruction. While what Mr. Assad has done has been barbaric and evil, the havoc that will be played upon this world if those weapons fall into the hands of Islamic extremists, we will never forget, and we will never forgive ourselves for what will happen. We need to work together collectively to address the problem of identifying and finding those weapons of mass destruction and securing those for the future. There are many people who are living outside of their country now as refugees, tens of thousands of able men who could be recruited to be a part of that solution. Thank you.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from Ohio rise? Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this week I will reintroduce a resolution recognizing September as National Childhood Obesity Awareness Month. September marks an opportunity for Congress to raise awareness of the issue while also discussing ways we can engage our families and communities on how best to curb this unhealthy trend. Over the past 3 decades, childhood obesity rates in the United States have tripled, and today nearly 1 in 3 children are overweight or obese. These numbers are even higher in minority communities where nearly 40% of African American and Hispanic children are overweight. Children today experience a different lifestyle from 30 years ago when kids ate less and exercised more. Many groups have stepped to the plate to improve nutrition and physical activity for our children. Community partners like the Campaign to End Obesity, Cheer for a Healthier America, YWCA, and Health Corps have taken the charge to help our children achieve the healthiest lives we can give them. Let us use the month of September to elevate the issue of childhood obesity and recognize our community partners. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time's expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, after 3.5 years, the Obama administration has failed to make its hallmark legislation, Obamacare, work. Instead, it has delayed or waived portions, including the so-called verification system. This was Obama's way of ensuring folks who receive federal assistance to buy health insurance met the criteria. Buried within 600 pages of red tape, the administration said it will no longer verify the information provided by individuals, but simply rely on self-reporting. Mr. Speaker, this opens a wide door to further fraud and abuse in our health care system. This fraud could amount to $250 billion in taxpayer-funded payments. That's no pocketbook change. That's why I urge my colleagues to support a common-sense bill, H.R. 2775, No Subsidies Without Verification Act, to protect taxpayer dollars and further chip away at this unworkable law. You know, the American people want and deserve and need much better.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon rise? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
The President has come to Congress, as he should, to ask authority for a military action, discretionary military action. The sad fact is he doesn't have to, because of a defective law passed by Congress in reaction to Nixon's bombing of Cambodia in 1973. The bill that Congress passed is a shadow of our constitutional authority regarding war and peace. And this President has come to us. That's good. The result is not yet known. It has already resulted perhaps in a diplomatic breakthrough. That is also good. But in the future, we need to make certain that each and every President comes to us when it's not defending the immediate interests of the United States against imminent or real attack our troops or our citizens. So I'll be reintroducing legislation to fix war powers, and in circumstances such as this in the future, require that the President come to the Congress before launching a discretionary military action. We must fix this law. This is a good precedent this President has set. Let's make it the law of the United States of America.
Gentleman's time expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
Address the House for 1 minute.
The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to urge the President and my colleagues to oppose any U.S. military action in Syria. Based on the evidence given to Congress, I have serious reservations about authorizing the use of military forces in another Mideastern country. The President has not convinced me that we have vital national security interests at stake in Syria or a clear military objective. There are far too many unanswered questions and unclear objectives. The constituents in the 24th District of Texas are deeply skeptical about the value of military intervention in Syria, and I fully agree with their concerns. On behalf of my constituents and many concerned Americans, I respectfully urge my colleagues to weigh the evidence fully and to be realistic about what can be achieved in military intervention. Let us vote for what's best for the United States. Keep the U.S. military out of Syria. Yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from New York rise? Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to commend the Obama administration for its willingness to consider a new alternative proposal for dealing with Syria. The proposal is to hand over all, and I stress all, of Syria's chemical weapons under the oversight of the international community and to safely and verifiably destroy them. This could actually remove those weapons from the battlefield and peacefully prevent the further use of them against the people of Syria or her neighbors. This idea has gained support from UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, as well as Russia and France. Mr. Speaker, this proposal needs to be vigorously pursued. The Syrian regime's attack against its own people using poisonous gas is morally reprehensible. And if this plan is successful, it could produce an outcome that everyone desires, preventing the Assad regime from using chemical weapons. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois rise? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, the American people are still struggling with a shaky economy. During the August district work period, the #1 question I heard from my constituents was, where are the jobs? Last week, we saw the unemployment rate in August drop to 7.3%, but for all the wrong reasons. People didn't find jobs. They stopped looking for them altogether. Between July and August, that amounted to more than 300,000 people. A smaller percentage of Americans are working or looking for work than at any time in the past 35 years. It is so discouraging to be told the recession is over, but then you look and you look, but you can't find a job. Employers around my district tell me the best stimulus for hiring is to reduce government regulations, cut taxes, simplify the tax code, and push for smaller government. Yet what do they see ahead? More uncertainty as states race to meet the October 1st deadline to set up expensive and confusing Obamacare exchanges. No wonder businesses aren't hiring. The Unaffordable Care Act doesn't give them the confidence that they need to be able to afford hiring new employees. Let's restore their confidence to hire and train new workers. The House has passed numerous jobs bills to reduce regulation on businesses. Let's have the Senate act.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from California rise?
I ask for unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute to extend and revise my time.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to speak on Syria. The real issue is that the Assad regime gassed more than 426 children and their parents. Those who perished died a horrible, horrific, merciless, and completely unnecessary death. We must come together and act with the President to create a credible threat of force and thereby deter the future use of chemical weapons. Now, I am somewhat optimistic that, as recently reported, Syria is willing to place its chemical weapons under international control. This solution could possibly bring a peaceful resolution. But we must remember that Iran is also watching. The Ayatollah is looking to see if the U.S. is willing to stand up against those who gas their own people. Will they really stand up then against the plan to build nuclear weapons? We need to stand with the President and send a message to the world that we mean what we say, that we won't allow Assad to keep gassing his own people, and that we won't allow Iran to develop a nuclear weapon. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
I seek unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to honor today a group of hometown heroes from Corpus Christi, Texas, the Corpus Christi Universal Little League team. Universal made it to the Little League World Series this year in Williamsport, Virginia, after they won the Southwest Regional Tournament. These young men showcased their talents on an international stage, defeating teams from Australia and Canada. They received a grand welcome home on Corpus Christi along Shoreline Boulevard with a parade where my district director, Bob Howder, presented them with a flag flown over the United States Capitol and a letter of congratulations from me. They are an inspiration to young men and women throughout Texas and America. This summer, they saw and demonstrated that hard work pays off. It's a feeling I know they will carry with them for many years to come. Way to go, Universal. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York rise?
I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's been more than 5 weeks since the House recessed for district work period, and all of our problems that we put on hold remain right here in front of us. This long list of challenges includes repealing the sequester. According to the nonpartisan CBO, sequestration will cost us about 750,000 jobs this year alone. Now is the time to act. Instead of messaging bills or playing procedural games in an attempt to repeal or defund the Affordable Care Act, we should be addressing unfinished business. Americans have sent us here to do a job, help put people back to work, and grow our economy. I encourage House Republicans to work with Democrats to roll back these mindless, thoughtless sequester cuts. They are the worst way to save a bad program and the most foolish way to cut a good and vibrant one. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Indiana rise?
Mr. Speaker, I request for unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hardworking Americans have called on Congress to stop Obamacare. While they expect that Washington elites will deride their message and disparage their cause, They're here because they understand the consequences of Obamacare's oppressive mandates. Back home over the month of August, I heard from parents who pay higher premiums only to have health coverage drop for their spouse. I've talked with Hoosiers who make ends meet with 2 part-time jobs after their hours were cut. I've seen the discouragement of neighbors who hope this is finally the week that they'll find work. Americans know that this isn't what a recovery looks like, but they wonder if Washington even cares. President Obama told them to trust the bureaucrats, the same bureaucrats who gave carve-outs to big business and kickbacks to big government. Republicans told them, we have a different plan. We promise to stop Obamacare and put patients ahead of politics. As Obamacare's October 1st deadline approaches, those families wonder if we really mean it. Mr. Speaker, now is the time to keep that promise. Now, when it really matters, we must stop Obamacare.
What purpose does the gentlewoman from North Carolina rise?
I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute, Mr. Speaker.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, because of Obamacare, health insurance costs could be increasing more than 80% for young North Carolinians. Yes, those who pay just over $100 a month now may have to pay $185 for Obamacare-approved coverage. The administration has attempted to console us with promises that the blow of such sharp cost increases will be softened for the neediest Americans through income-based taxpayer subsidies. However, there's a problem. It's not just needy Americans who will have access. Because the Obama administration has decided to rely on an honor system for subsidy distribution to draw money, income won't have to be verified, and neither will one's access to, quote, affordable, end quote, employer-provided health coverage. We are told this honor system will be temporary, but we are not satisfied. Develop a verification system now or delay the subsidies. Better yet, give every American a break and repeal this law. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Last week we learned even more distressing news about our economy. The labor force participation rate is the lowest since 1979 during Jimmy Carter's presidency. We refuse to settle for the new normal, and Americans deserve better. And how do the President and the Democrats in Congress plan to make things better? Well, they still insist on the full implementation of Obamacare, which its own authors already describe as a train wreck. But the House is working to dismantle this unworkable law, and we're taking another major step this week. We're introducing legislation that will prevent waste, fraud, and abuse in the distribution of Obamacare subsidies. House Republicans will continue to work to protect Americans from the harmful effects of this law. It's all part of our plan to foster a strong economy and a more structured and secure future for all.
The gentleman from Michigan seek recognition.
Unanimous consent to speak to the House for 1 minute.
Gentleman without objection, the gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've spent the last few weeks back home listening to my constituents and hearing their stories of just how tough times are in Obama economy. And what's the latest economic news? More of the same. Another disappointing jobs report was issued by the Labor Department last week. We learned that far too many of our fellow Americans have simply given up looking for work. The labor force participation rate is at the lowest since 1979. Is this what Americans should come to expect? Is this the new normal? Americans deserve better than this mediocre economy. House Republicans remain committed to fostering a stronger economy and more secure future. Our plan revolves around more jobs and expanding opportunity instead of stifling it. That's how we'll get our economy back to work. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, the Chair will postpone further proceedings today on motions to suspend the rules on which a recorded vote or the yeas and nays are ordered, or on which the vote incurs objection under Clause 6 of Rule 20. Record votes on postponed questions will be taken later. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1155 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 1155, a bill to reform the National Association of Registered Agents and Brokers and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Nagelbauer, and the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott, will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days which end to revise and extend their remarks and submit extraneous materials for the record on H.R. 1155 as amended, currently under consideration.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I yield my such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak on this important piece of insurance regulatory reform legislation today. The most serious regulatory challenges facing insurance agents and brokers are redundant, costly, and sometimes contradictory requirements that arise when they seek licenses on a multi-state basis. It has become clear that the main cause of these problems is the failure of many states to issue licenses on a truly reciprocal basis. On average, multi-state agents sell insurance in 8 states. That means that 8 different applications, 8 different procedures for admittance, and separate background checks, and multiple inconsistent standards and duplicative processes. These requirements are not only costly and inefficient, but they hinder the ability of insurance agents, brokers, to effectively address the needs of their consumers. Congress recognized the need for reform in the insurance industry's licensing system back in 1999 when it incorporated the National Association of Registered Agents and Brokers subtitle into the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. The Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act did not provide for immediate establishment of NAREB. Instead, it included a series of provisions to encourage states to simplify the licensing process. Nationally, unfortunately, the original NAREB that was passed in 1999 did not work, and nationally, non-residential licensing reciprocity has not been achieved, and the burden of insurance agents and brokers and the impact on this burden has directly impacted our consumers. Despite the best efforts of many stakeholders at making state-level improvements, it has become clear that true licensing reciprocity can be only achieved through additional congressional action. This bill we're considering today, H.R. 1155, NAREB Reform Act, or as it commonly referred to as NAREB 2, modifies the original NAREB provisions in Gramm-Leach-Bliley and immediately establishes NAREB as a private, non-profit entity managed by a board composed of 8 insurance regulators and 5 marketplace representatives. NAREB 2 provides for non-resident insurance agent and broker licensing while preserving the rights of states to supervise and discipline insurance agents and brokers. Overall, this legislation would benefit policyholders by increasing marketplace competition and consumer choice, and by enabling insurance producers to more quickly and responsibly serve the needs of their consumers. I'd like to thank my colleague, Mr. Scott from Georgia, who introduced this piece of legislation with me earlier this year. This bill has almost 90 bipartisan co-sponsors and is supported by groups such as the Independent Insurance Agents and Brokers of America, the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, the National Association of Insurance Financial Advisors, and the Council of Insurance Agents and Brokers, and major insurance company trades. This legislation passed this chamber by voice vote twice before, and the Senate Banking Committee unanimously approved an identical companion legislation. I ask that my colleagues support this practical and needed insurance regulatory reform by voting for NAREB Reform Act. With that, I reserve my time.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may need. But first of all, Mr. Speaker, I want to just say I know I join many people across this nation and around the world who are prayerful and who are hopeful that this breakthrough, this window of opportunity that we have dealing with the Syrian situation works. Now, Mr. Speaker, I can't tell you what a great joy this is for me. I've worked on this bill for the past 6 years. We have been dealing with many areas to fix our financial system, to make it work. We have a very complex and complicated financial system. There is no industry that has the challenges that are being faced today as the insurance industry. And the economy, its demands are rapidly changing because of advances in technology, mobility, the narrowing and making the world much smaller. And so, essentially, what we have here is a long overdue fix to help these small business owners, because that's what our insurance agents are. H.R. 1155, the National Association of the Registered Agents and Brokers Act, or what we affectionately call NARAB, as my distinguished colleague from Texas, Mr. Nuckmeyer, has just stated, is very dear to us. Many of us in the Financial Services Committee have spent years toiling on this issue. So have many in the Senate. And as my colleague, Mr. Nuckmeyer, has said, we passed one House in 1999. But look what has happened. We've had terrorist strikes. We've had all kinds of things that have happened. We've had an economy almost on the verge of depression. And standing there in the middle of this storm, dealing with the wants and the needs of the American people in all the areas, property damage, health, car insurance, you name it, has been our agents. So I want to just briefly take you through exactly what we're proposing here. H.R. 1155, first of all, creates a streamlined agent and broker licensing system. That's very important. That strengthens the competitive insurance market while maintaining those ever important consumer protection items. It strengthens the business, it strengthens the competitive insurance market, doesn't weaken it, and at the same time strengthens and protects our consumers. NARAB will allow agents and brokers to more efficiently operate on a multi-state basis. Now that's so important. Business is no longer conducted around the corner or down the street or just in the next town. It's all over the country. And our insurance agents and brokers need the flexibility and the smoothness in our system to be able to negotiate in the best interest of not just the insurance industry, but most importantly, for the benefit of consumers who move from state to state to city to city. Now, next, NARAB would allow our agents and brokers to also address the increasing concern and greater importance of our technological and mobile connected world. As we know, we are all connected. Next, our NARAB Act will be a one-stop licensing compliance mechanism for insurance agents and brokers operating out of their home states. Each will have a home state. But NARAB will work as a one-place clearinghouse to satisfy that, while at the same time preserving the long-standing authority of states to supervise and discipline the insurance producers. The states, nothing is being taken from state control in this bill. As a matter of fact, it strengthens states' controls, and that's why all of the state insurance commissioners support this legislation. and through a nonprofit board for insurance agents and brokers to obtain approval to operate on a multi-basis, NARAB Reform Act deals only with marketplace entry and would not impact the day-to-day state regulation of insurance agencies. We sat down, we brought the state insurance agencies in and the commissioners to work with us so that we could have a joint understanding on this bill. NARAB will be governed by a board dominated by state regulators, again, dominated by state regulators, and would establish standards for the membership that exceed the existing requirements of any state. Again, exceeds the requirements of any state. A prospective NARAB member would be required to be fully licensed in his or her home state and satisfy rigorous membership criterion. And an approved NARAB member could utilize the association to obtain the regulatory approval necessary to operate in any other selected jurisdiction. This is a crucial piece of legislation, an excellently drafted piece of legislation. And for those of us who are concerned about small government, it's very important to note that NARAB would not be a part of a report to any federal agency and would not have any kind of federal regulatory power. We're out of the business once we pass this bill. It's in the hands where it belongs, at the state and local level. The legislation is supported by nearly the entire insurance industry, including all the major agents and brokers associations, as well as the major insurers association. Additionally, the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, NAIC, which represents all state insurance commissioners, has formally endorsed this version of the legislation. This state-based reform benefits our consumers first, and that's at the head of the line of our concerns. And it benefits our consumers through increased competition among agents and brokers and lead to greater consumer choice at lower prices. That's what the consumer is looking for. This bill also will assist in an important sector of our economy, small businesses, by streamlining non-resident licensing regulation. The House has twice recognized the need for this common sense reform by passing nearly this identical legislation, as I said before, subsequent to suspension rules. And once again, we ask for your support. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Georgia reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield 2 minutes to the chairman of our Capital Markets Committee, Mr. Garrett from New Jersey.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the chairman and the gentleman from Texas for your leadership on this legislation today. I rise in support of H.R. 1155, which is the National Association of Registered Agents and Brokers Reform Act. You know, this bill is, as we like to say, a common sense step that would create a clearinghouse, if you will, for insurance agents and brokers alike to obtain approval to operate on a multi-state basis. You know, under current law, an insurance agent has clients in more than one state. We have to obtain licenses in each and every one of those states. And so the regulatory process, as you can imagine, varies from state to state. So obtaining and maintaining a license is both time-consuming and very expensive. So having to complete this process over and over and over again basically compounds the difficulty and often proves daunting, quite honestly, to smaller agents who are, well, just trying to do their job and to serve their clients and meet their needs. So what we have here now is a NARAB clearinghouse. This would allow the agents to complete the process only twice, once in their home state and then once again for NARAB. And then they'd be eligible to sell basically in all the states. Here's an important point. NARAB is supported by all the stakeholders, including, as the gentleman just said, by the state insurance regulators. And it does so because it brings much-needed efficiency to a multi-state licensing process. And while doing this, the legislation would also preserve, and to me this is very important, state-based insurance regulation and also consumer protection. Finally, this legislation would not, as was just pointed out, create a brand new federal insurance regulator in its place. You see, by law, NARAB would not be a regulator or a part of any federal agency. It would have no regulatory authority. So with 56 different approaches to life insurance, this bipartisan bill would reduce this needless red tape and complexity that's out there, and it would help insurance agents better serve their clients. So I urge this House to adopt this legislation today, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Radel, for comment. Oh, I'm sorry. Got the speakers. Correct that to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Fincher, for 2 minutes.
The gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today as a co-sponsor and supporter of H.R. 1155, the National Association of Registered Agents and Brokers Reform Act of 2013. As mentioned, this important legislation strikes the appropriate balance between easing the licensing requirements for insurance agents and preserving state authority to supervise and discipline insurance producers for their actions. Through this legislation, I hope all consumers, especially the citizens of Tennessee, will benefit from a more competitive insurance market. NARAB is supported by all insurance industry stakeholders, including state insurance regulators, regional and national insurance companies, and trade associations. H.R. 1155 is seen as the most effective, efficient way to enable insurance agents and brokers to be licensed on a multi-state basis while retaining state regulatory authority. While today's legislation speaks to insurance agents and brokers, similar issues exist for claims adjusters. To address these issues, when consumers have a claim, I introduced the Claim Act, H.R. 2156, to streamline the licensing requirements for insurance adjusters operating outside their home states. My bill would preserve state authority to supervise and discipline adjusters for their actions while streamlining state licensing regulations. As we join together today to support H.R. 1155, I call upon my colleagues to similarly support the Claim Act to ensure consumers receive the same excellent service when they need their insurance. I thank the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Nagelbauer, for his hard work on this very well thought through legislation, and I hope it will help the citizens of this country receive excellent insurance products and services, and with that I yield back.
Gentleman from Tennessee yields back. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
I reserve my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Speaker, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Radel, is recognized for 1 minute.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of this bill introduced by my colleague, Representative Nagelbauer. This bill reduces costs for homeowners and renters, not only in my home state of Florida, but for everyone throughout the entire country. Today, insurance brokers and agents face hurdles when they try and work across state lines. What this bill does is make it easier and less expensive for them to get licensed in multiple states. The best part about this, ultimately, it saves you, the consumer, money. The legislation streamlines the federal role in real estate licensing while allowing states to continue setting standards for the work that best fits their states, because after all, we know what's best for our states and our communities. Lowering costs for insurance agents and brokers means more options and lower prices for consumers. I'm glad to support this bipartisan legislation. I encourage all of my colleagues to vote for the NARAB Reform Act, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
I reserve the balance of my time, Mr.
Gentleman from Georgia reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I reserve. I yield back to the gentleman to close.
Gentleman from Georgia is now recognized.
But the gentleman has no more speakers. I yield back. I just want to say what a distinguished pleasure it has been to work with the gentleman from Texas, my good friend, on both the Financial Services Committee and the Ag Committee. We do a lot of great work together. It's a great pleasure, and I commend this bill to the full House of Representatives. Hope we have a unanimous vote.
Georgia yields back. Gentleman from Texas.
Well, and I also want to thank the gentleman from Georgia. He's been worked tirelessly on this issue. You know, what's, I think, nice about this issue is it's bipartisan. It's good piece of legislation. It doesn't expand government, doesn't cost the taxpayers any money, and ultimately I think is going to bring better choices for consumers, help small business people across the country. And, for example, in my congressional district, it is closer to 3 or 4 other states than it is to some of the cities that are within my state. For example, from Lubbock to within 100 miles of Colorado, within a couple of 100 miles from Oklahoma and Colorado, and so these other states. And so basically we have a lot of insurance agencies and agents that will have the ability to do business in multi-states in a less cumbersome way. And so I encourage all of my colleagues to support this bill. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1155 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Gentleman from Texas.
I ask for the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. Sufficient number having arisen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this motion will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 2747.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 2747, a bill to amend Title 40, United States Code, to transfer certain functions from the Government Accountability Office to the Department of Labor relating to the processing of claims for the payment of workers who are not paid appropriate wages under certain provisions of such title.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Wahlberg, and the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Courtney, each will control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks on H.R. 2747.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong support of H.R. 2747 and yield myself such time as I may consume. With our nation,
gentleman's recognized.
Thank you. With our nation facing difficult challenges at home and abroad, it is important we continue the work the American people sent us here to do. That includes pursuing common sense reforms that will make the federal government more efficient and a better steward of taxpayer dollars. The legislation we are considering today is a small yet important part of that effort. Approximately 1 out of every 5 workers is employed by a federal contractor. Drawing on the strengths and expertise of the private sector workforce to complete federal projects has helped deliver better results at a more competitive price for taxpayers. A number of laws govern the wages workers on federal projects receive. For example, the Davis-Bacon Act requires federal contractors to pay workers the local prevailing wage. Additionally, the Contract Work Hours and Safety Standards Act ensures these workers receive 1 1/2 times their basic rate of pay for hours worked in excess of 40 hours a week. Both laws have played a central role in federal contracting for decades. However, both are plagued by inefficiencies. The Department is responsible for enforcing these laws, yet the Government Accountability Office has long been a middleman in an overly bureaucratic claims process. Here is how the current process works. Mr. Speaker, the Department of Labor first determines whether workers have failed to receive their proper wages and calculates the amount of pay they are due. Next, the Department forwards to GAO a report that states the names of underpaid employees and the amount they each are owed. Funds from the relevant contracting agencies are delivered to GAO, which then deposits the money into an account at the Treasury Department. Based upon claims forms submitted by affected workers, GAO transmits payments requests to Treasury, which disperses directly to workers their unpaid wages. It should be noted that GAO has no authority to overturn or even challenge the Department's judgment in this area. As a result of this lengthy back and forth between numerous federal entities, workers can experience delays in receiving their correct wages, and taxpayers are forced to support an unnecessarily complex process. I think we can all agree we can do better. H.R. 2747 is common sense and bipartisan legislation that would transfer GAO's administrative duties under these two laws to the proper federal agency, which is the Department of Labor. GAO has requested this relief and believes it will encourage more efficiency within the federal government. Furthermore, it will free up time and resources at GAO that can be better spent fulfilling its central mission of investigating waste and abuse in the federal government. By moving wage claims adjustments for federally contracted workers to the Department of Labor, we can ensure workers receive their pay in a timelier manner while providing greater efficiency. Quite simply, Mr. Speaker, this legislation is a win for workers and for taxpayers. I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 2747 and reserve the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of the pending legislation, H.R. 2747, the Streamlining Claims Processing for Federal Contractor Employees Act, which will transfer authority for processing claims under Davis-Bacon Act from the Government Accountability Office to the Department of Labor. As the Department of Labor is already responsible for many aspects of Davis-Bacon, this change will help streamline the process and ensure that workers receive their hard-earned pay in a timelier and more efficient manner. I would like to thank the gentleman from Michigan for introducing this common sense fix, which I am pleased to co-sponsor. It is time that we transfer this administrative responsibility to the agency that enforces the law, and I hope that this bill will be the first step in a larger effort to allow the Department of Labor to engage in further enforcement actions under the Davis-Bacon Act, including the GAO's current debarment authority. As a strong supporter of Davis-Bacon and the protection it provides our contracted workers, I am pleased to see that this bill will help streamline the process and allow our workers to access to the prevailing wages that they rightly earned. That's why I rise in support of H.R. 2747, and I thank the gentleman from Michigan for introducing the bill. I urge my colleagues to support this common sense proposal and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I have no further speakers to speak to this issue, and I would be glad to close.
The gentleman is recognized.
I want to thank the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Courtney, as well, not only for his support of the legislation, but for his leadership on this issue. As members of the House Subcommittee on Workforce Protections, we are privileged to oversee a number of federal laws and agencies that directly affect the lives of workers and their families, the basis for this country's greatness. The Davis-Bacon Act is one law in particular that I believe is in need of additional reform. Independent reports have highlighted administrative challenges facing the law that result in workers being shortchanged and taxpayers being overcharged on federal construction projects. I know there are sharp differences over what, if any, Davis-Bacon reform would look like. But I believe we've demonstrated today, Mr. Speaker, how incremental yet important change can occur when we work together in good faith on behalf of the American people. At the very least, I hope we can continue to discuss these issues with one another, thereby bringing us closer to common ground that is necessary to move this country forward. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on H.R. 2747 and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Michigan yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 2747? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I request the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this motion will be postponed.
Where's the Is there any penalty for not showing up?
Well, no, but, you know...
When does it start up?
Yes, exactly. 15-minute mark.
So you give about a 10-minute window for a pause, and that's it.
Things really, you know, people will start coming up here maybe the 4 to 5 minute mark if they don't start trying to find a different manager before that.
Okay.
What purpose does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass S-130.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar number 137, Senate